So good morning, afternoon, evening, everyone. Welcome to today's Lux Research webinar, Why You Need to Stop Making Technology Roadmaps and What to Do Instead. I'm Paul Kortfunke, Senior Consultant here at Lux Research, and I'll be your moderator for today's session. As innovation leaders, we've long used technology roadmaps to guide development. But today, where ideas are abound and R&D can be outsourced, competitive edges come from execution, aligning technical work with business and market needs and delivering innovation at the right time. Traditional roadmaps fall short. We now need innovation roadmaps, tools that span the entire journey from idea to impact, not just the technology side. To explore this shift, we're joined by my colleague, Dr. Arie van Berkel. He is the Chief Product Officer at Lux Research. He will bring in his deep experience in bridging strategy and execution and will explain how to build innovation roadmaps that align development with business goals, capabilities, and market timing. Throughout the webinar, you can type any questions you have in the question box on your screen. That should be somewhere on the right of your screen. Time permitting, we will answer all the questions that we can. If your question doesn't get answered, please do not hesitate to email it to Lux Research and we will respond. If at any point you experience technical difficulties, such as a frozen screen, simply refresh your browser and check that your internet connection is strong. Arie, the screen is yours.
Okay, thank you, Paul. Thanks everyone for joining. I see we have quite a crowd here today, and I was kind of expecting that. I'm very happy to be here and to present this webinar to you. I've had already some people nervously calling me because Paul and we've been doing quite a few roadmaps now for quite a few different organizations. And some of them have now wondered, why are we suddenly saying that you should stop making roadmaps? So here's the spoiler, you shouldn't stop making roadmaps, but you should stop making technology roadmaps. And that word technology in there, that makes a world of difference. And that's what I want to talk to you about today. And that's also what to do instead. But let's take a step back first and let's see why you're actually road mapping. What is the purpose of a roadmap, right? So we're going to go following a roadmap. Why wouldn't we today? We'll start by exploring the valley. And which valley? It's not a great valley. You will see in a moment. As you're traveling down the road, as you're following the roadmap, as you're following that journey, you will need to find companions. And we will talk about that later on. And then we'll talk about how you can actually reach the summit, how you can reach your innovation destination, if you like. And of course, if you like that kind of poetry. When we start in the valley. Which valley? Well, the valley about how you improve your conversion of R&D efforts into revenue. And that's a question that we get asked increasingly. It's been a notable increase over the past, let's say, 2 years, where basically since the interest rates went up, that clients have been asking us, how do we improve our conversion of our R&D expenditure into actual revenue? We're concerned, our clients are concerned that they're not up to speed, they're not really at the top when it comes to really benefiting from their R&D efforts. Too many projects are stalled somewhere and never make it into the pilot phase, never make it into commercialization. So how do we improve that? Well, this is not a new problem. In fact, I think everyone on this webinar probably is familiar with the Valley of Death. And for all time's sake, for some nostalgia, but also just to go back to the source, just to go to unclutter the entire discussion about it, I went back to the original definition, to the original first proposal of the term Valley of Death, right? And that's 2007, a report by the Phoenix Center, actually published in September 2007, which contained this figure, and that's the original valley of death figure. I'm sure there are many more beautiful pictures now of the valley of death, but I think this still gets the message across. So what is that valley of death, right? There's promising innovations that you took a conscious decision on to work on. So they were good. Those were good ideas. Otherwise, you wouldn't have started an R&D project, right? And yet they don't make it into implied research and piloting and commercialization. Why not? And that same report actually already contains a clue to that question. And it looked, and this is an actual statistical analysis of projects, right? And it looks at projects that look at profit maximization across the stages, and in this case, the research distinguished between 3 stages. So you could say basic research, piloting, commercialization, for example. And it looked at the probability of funding projects, and it distinguished between 2 types of arguments for doing the project. One type of argument is purely economic, and the other type of argument is also factoring in non-economic elements. For example, we will become more sustainable, or this is the technology of the future, or something along those lines. And you can see that there's a notable dent in the probability of funding if you factor in the wrong arguments in your stage 1. So the key takeaway I get from this is you need to make sure that you're taking that decision to fund your initial project. That decision needs to be based on the right arguments, which brings the problem back to only figuring out what the right arguments are. And that's the trick. That's what you need to do. And how do you do that? Well, the tool you use for that is to look at the perception of your project by the rest of your company. And this is another innovation survey that was done fairly recently. This is a publication from March 2025, looking at industrial companies, so companies that manufacture some type of equipment, and distinguishing between companies that do innovate and companies that had the option to innovate but decided not to pursue that innovation. And if you look at what the obstacles are to innovation that are mentioned by the leaders of those companies, the people who are proposing the innovations, you can see that for firms that do not innovate, the biggest obstacle to innovation actually was the perceived economic risk. And then the question, of course, becomes perceived by whom? So economic risks are important. They block innovation. The perception of economic risks is one of the main causes of the valley of death, you could say. And how do you deal with that? And of course, communicating about innovation, which is obviously essential if you want to change that perception, is difficult. And we know that. And this is a survey from 2013, but I think if we were to repeat, and it's not our survey, by the way, it's done by a company called Innovation Excellence, IX Research. But it's good because it's one of the most extensive surveys out there about communication. And that was one of the surprises also when preparing for this webinar. There's a lot of anecdotal information about communication, about innovation. There's not a lot of actual surveys. There's a little bit in the European Community Innovation Survey, but that data is pretty hard to access. We'll be trying that later on, not in this webinar. However, this is a good survey, and I think if we were to repeat the survey today, we would get pretty similar results. So how often do people whose profession it is to do innovations for their company, people like a CTO or a Chief Innovation Officer or a VP of Innovation, Director of Open Innovation, those type of people, how often do they experience problems in communicating clearly what they're doing, what the innovations are all about? You can see a majority of them experiences such problems at least once a month. And if you look at once a month or once a quarter, maybe in quarterly reviews, you can see that the overwhelming majority experiences problems within that time period. And then who are you communicating with? What people are you trying to communicate with when you experience those problems? Right? And again, this doesn't add up to 100. So apparently people can experience problems with multiple different functions within the company. But you can see that over 60% mentions that they experience trouble communicating clearly the benefits of their innovation with senior leaders and executives. And then communicating with other departments seems to be an equally large problem. And this tracks with some things we've discussed during our Lux roundtables, where some of the people in our roundtable have actually said, well, it's not too difficult to convince my CEO of the innovations I'm doing, but I have trouble convincing the business unit leaders, the managing directors of the business units of this. So you can see, how do you convert, how do you essentially bridge the valley of death? How do you improve conversion of R&D into commercial application? You have to work on the perception of your projects, which also means you have to accept that some projects that you think are good, you should not be started because you listen to the perception of other parts of your company. But you have to get that communication with other parts of your company in order to get the support and to get a smooth transition from basic R&D from stage 1 all the way to stage 3 to commercial application. And that's what we're about to talk about today. So we're going to talk about innovation roadmaps. And now you can get the first clue as to why we say you have to stop talking about technology roadmaps. Don't make technology roadmaps. The moment you make a technology roadmap, you're not only limiting the rest of the company in thinking about your roadmap. The rest of the company will say, okay, that's a technology roadmap. Great. The technology guys will take care of that. Now I can go on with my business, right? That shouldn't be the case. Everyone should be interested in the roadmap, in the innovation roadmap for your company. So don't call it a technology roadmap because you're limiting the interest of the rest of the company. And you're also self-limiting. You're limiting your own interest as well. And that's a problem because if you want to get to your first of a kind investment, if you want to build that first pilot plant, there are actually, in our experience, 5 different factors that need to come together. You need a convergence of 5 things to happen in order for that final investment decision in the first of a kind unit to occur. And most of you, I'm sure, are already focused on technology readiness level. And obviously that is an important condition. Right? If the technology readiness level is not high enough, then you simply cannot build that first of a kind unit. So you need that to be in order. Great. And you're all working on it, I have no doubts. But it's not sufficient. You need to have a clear product definition. You need to productize your technology. So your technology not only has to be ready, it also has to be a clear product. And by a clear product, I mean a clear offering to the market of what this thing can do, for whom it is destined, who do you want to sell it to, where do you want to sell it, etc. The market around it needs to be organized. What do we mean by market organization? That means that there needs to be a supply chain, there needs to be a value chain ready. Maybe you need distributors, maybe you need suppliers for raw materials, Maybe you need people to educate potential users of your product. So maybe you need training, but also maybe you need legislation, or maybe you need insurance. So there's a soft infrastructure around your market that also needs to be organized. Of course, the market needs to be ready, meaning somebody must be there that you can identify that is really eager to buy your product. And finally, it usually helps if you have a product that you can actually produce it. This may sound silly, but you have to be able to actually construct the factory. So you need suppliers, you need equipment manufacturers, you need engineering firms that are able and willing to build the unit that you just invented and designed. This is way more than a technology roadmap. You need a roadmap that brings together all of these different elements, these 5 different elements, and not only brings them together in a sense that they're at the right level, they also need to be at the right timing. So they need to come together at the right time. And this is why you need a roadmap. This is what an innovation roadmap should accomplish for you. Just as an example, right, you can see the intelligent and connected vehicles roadmap here. This is a pretty successful roadmap. It is a roadmap that's developed globally. But as you can see, and I hope you can see it, I do apologize, I had to cram a pretty extensive picture into a very small space, but you can look it up on the internet. If you type intelligent and connected vehicles roadmap, you get the full document. It's a pretty long and quite insightful PDF document, but it only talks about technology. So it doesn't tell you what needs you're trying to fulfill with those intelligent and connected vehicles. What is the product that is going to be possible in 2026 once you hit all those technology milestones for 2025? It doesn't talk about the market organization. It doesn't contain any actions to, for example, towards insurance companies or towards legislators. Is the market ready? Who is supposed to be the launching customer for these technologies? Who's going to buy this first? Are you after the consumer markets? Are you looking for taxi companies, fleet owners, what are mining companies? There's so many organizations using vehicles, but what's the roadmap for the market? And finally, the production. How does the value chain develop here? And of course, those two are connected. If you're aiming for a small market to begin with, let's say you're aiming for connected vehicles on mining sites, then the production value chain will also initially be small, which has implications for how you develop that value chain. So it's a great roadmap, but it's missing a few pieces. So what is a good roadmap that's not missing those pieces? Well, a good roadmap has to contain at least 4 layers, and I would usually prefer it to contain 5 layers. So there has to be a market layer, a product layer, a technology layer, and a skills and facilities layer. And I think an even better roadmap would also contain an impact layer. So the impact layer is the impact that you want to achieve with your development overall. So if you're developing an intelligent and connected vehicles roadmap, the impact could be everyone can use a car, even if you don't have a driving license. That might be the 2050 goal. We have many roadmaps where the impact is we have a net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050, for example. That's an impact goal. Next, you need to define what needs to happen in the markets. What kind of markets, what new markets do you want to create? What new markets do you want to enter as an organization? What change do you want to accomplish in the market in order to achieve your impact goal? Once you've defined that, you can start thinking about what products you would want to offer to the market to achieve your goals within that market. So if your goals in the market, let's stick with the intelligent and connected vehicles example. Your goal in the market may be, we have autonomous taxis in every US city. Could be a market goal. Then the product is not too hard to guess. It's probably you need to develop an autonomous taxi. You probably also need to develop an autonomous taxi service. So that's two products. And there's an order to them. Probably first the autonomous taxi, then the service. That's what I would do. From there, you can project back to technologies. Why are you not building an autonomous taxi today? And I know, rest assured, I know some companies are actually already building autonomous taxis today. But why are you not doing it? Well, you probably lack certain technologies. And to develop those technologies, you may even lack certain skills. What's important about this, and now we're getting to the companion part. So now we're finding your companions, right? You needed to find companions for your journey. Every layer of this type of roadmap has a different group of people, has a different part of your organization that needs to define the goals there, that needs to decide on the goals, right? Your top management, your CEO, needs to define the impact. Your sales and business development departments need to have an opinion on the market. Your business unit, your production organization needs to have an opinion on the product. And then your technology organization, your R&D, your innovation organization needs to have an opinion on the skills, on the technology. And finally, it all gets back at the skills level, which is often neglected in roadmaps. The skills level, again, is something to decide on by senior management or even by our CEO. And this is about taking a completely new direction as a company. This is about saying, when you're, say, Yara, who actually did this, and you're a company that produces fertilizer, that at the skills level, you actually want to acquire the skill to develop sensors. And this is how Yara ended up developing their nitrogen sensor, which helps farmers be very precise about dosing fertilizer. Right? That's a strategy decision for the company, not only to change the impact is better use of fertilizer. The market impact for Yara was at least partially change from being a commodity provider, a fertilizer provider, to becoming a service company. But the impact, the fundamental decision at the skills level was, we need to create a new department. We need to create a laboratory, a technology department that is able to develop sensors. That's a senior management decision. So the roadmap, when you view the roadmap in this way, is a dialogue. It is a series of questions that cascades down through your organization, through the various levels, followed, and you can see some of those questions here, of course, followed by a series of answers that cascades up through the various levels. And typically, it turns into a dialogue. So it will be followed up by more precise questions, followed up by more precise answers or different answers, and so forth. And that is how the roadmap gets created, with the buy-in of everyone. So everyone knows why those, even those esoteric projects that you're doing. For example, developing a sensor, well, everyone knows that we're actually producing fertilizer. Everyone knows why those projects exist and why it's important to take the next step in those projects. Here's a good example of a roadmap. I'm not sharing very many roadmaps in this webinar. And the reason is roadmaps tend to be rather sensitive. So we cannot go around publishing many of our clients' roadmaps, but this is something that we developed together with with Mackenzie for the Net Zero Technology Center. And even while they called it a technology roadmap, it really, if you look at the summary, and this is the summary page of that roadmap, this is really a market roadmap, as you can see. These are things, this is the market level of the roadmap, which wasn't even the top level, but the really top level of this roadmap, of course, was net zero. Right? And the name Net Zero Technology Center kind of gives it away. So how do you reach the summit? Now that we know why roadmaps exist and that roadmaps are a platform for internal communication, how do you go about making them? Now, as I told you before, Paul and his team, and I've had the privilege to work with them quite frequently, have been doing quite a lot of that. And so we developed a full method for doing it. And before embarking on the roadmap, it's good to know, and we won't get into details too much here, but it's good to know that the road mapping process is part of a bigger strategy cycle, where you have to first establish your positioning as an organization, as a company. You have to translate that into goals, and then you have to translate your goals into a plan. That's the road mapping process. Once you've done that, you still need to execute the plan, of course, and you need to review if you're actually hitting your targets. For today, we're only focusing on the road mapping part. So we're going to assume you have the foundations already. You have some sense of what the goals should be for the roadmap. That's the high level goals. That's the impact or the market level goals that we talked about. And then we have a whole process. It's 5 steps, or basically it's 5 steps, and it's 2 decision points. One decision point is developing or establishing your strategic research and innovation agenda. And the second step, second decision, is deciding on your implementation action plan. And to do that, we do it in 5 steps. We start with identifying the key opportunities, the main, let's say, lines, the main parts, constituting parts of your roadmap, the things to put on the roadmap. For those, we specify targets, and we break those targets down in a timeline. So there's one overall target, and there are steps towards that overall target. Those 3 steps complete the strategic research and innovation agenda. So this is only just asking questions. How can we get to those targets? The second part, the next 2 steps, is about providing answers. So identify solutions that you can work on, and then create an implementation plan, which means define the projects that you want to do. Let's look at a couple of examples that are, we think, good examples. Here's the Smart Industry Roadmap, which is by now about 8 years old. It identifies 10 opportunities for product development. So it starts with this whole Industry 4.0, which is a big concept, but not very actionable. And it identifies 10 different opportunities to work on. Now, this is a good example of finding key opportunities. And this by itself is quite a bit of study, right? How do you split this? How do you distinguish between good opportunities and things that are not so attractive? So that's one example. Then perhaps the most, this is interesting, the most successful roadmap ever is the semiconductor industry roadmap. They actually call it a technology roadmap, but it really isn't, because it pays attention to development of the value chain of the products, of the market organization, of the market readiness also. So it really is a comprehensive, integrated innovation roadmap. And as you can see here, specifying targets. One of the success factors of the semiconductor roadmap is that it has very specific, it is very clear on targets, even as clear as defining the wafer size, for example, and defining when the industry is supposed to switch from one wafer size to another, from 300 to 450 millimeters, for example. I showed you the UK Net Zero Technology Center roadmap before, and this is in the document, and this is about defining solutions. And it shouldn't be a surprise. We often end up using a 2x2, often something about the relative importance of the solution. How important is it to achieve the targets compared to how difficult is it to use those technologies, right? How attractive are they? And this is precisely what we did for that roadmap to identify all the different technologies to work on. And then finally, and I won't cram in a picture, you need an implementation plan. You need a description of all the projects. At the end of all this, you haven't started the project yet. All you have is a description of the projects that you need to start developing. And remember that strategy cycle. After that, you need to put that in action. And that's a whole different chapter of its own that hopefully will also be hosting a webinar on soon. So, roadmaps are a communication platform. Don't call them technology roadmaps, because then you limit the communicative power of it to yourself and also to the people you need involved. A roadmap is a dialogue. Creating a roadmap is a dialogue within your company. So you need a structured approach to it. So create that structure and spend a lot of time, spend more time than you would expect. You should become a little bit uneasy about how much time you spend finding the right questions. But finding the right questions is usually extremely powerful. And it usually also already implies the best answers. And make sure you consider those 5 factors: product, technology readiness level, market organization, market readiness, and production. Make sure you take an integral view of all of these different factors. I'll leave it at that. I'll turn back to you, Paul. Maybe you have some comments based on what we discussed, maybe some experience, and otherwise I'm curious to see if there's already some questions perhaps.
No, I don't have a lot of comments or addition to add. If anyone is interested, we're happy to connect separately. There's quite a lot of case studies and stories that we could share, but I don't think there's no room in this webinar for discussing those examples. So we'll be happy to connect separately to have that discussion. But there is quite some activity in the chat with questions, and I selected a couple of them, Ari. So the first question that comes from the participants in this webinar is that if you look at that innovation roadmap, it really looks at medium long term, and some of these stretch out to 2050 even. But how do you balance that long-term plan with the need to show short-term return on investment, which is getting, in my company, I get a lot of pressure on explaining how do I get return on investment on the short term on my innovation?
Right, so I would say, yes, a roadmap needs to have a long-term perspective, but that doesn't mean that you can not have short-term milestones on it. And particularly if you succeed in getting all of the business units, for example, involved in a discussion about the roadmap, which is different from putting them in charge of the roadmap. So they shouldn't be taking the decisions, or they should at least not be the only decision makers in the roadmap. But if you can get them involved, I'm sure they will have a couple of short-term targets that you can put on the roadmap. And when you have that discussion, you can also have the discussion of whether a short-term milestone for a product, let's say, is also relevant for the further longer-term development. So do you learn something from developing this product that is going to help you in the next milestone for products? Is it going to teach you something about technology or about production, for example, that will be helpful for the following milestone? So the short-term objectives will be there, the pressure will be there, the roadmap will help you to put that pressure in the context of the longer-term developments. which means you can see if it's useful for longer term developments or not, for example.
A related question is about a company that's really it's from a company that's really used to use technology roadmaps, and that question is, how will changing to an innovation roadmap actually improve the return on investment? Because we do have they already have those set goals in that technology roadmap, and they're really delivering against them. So how would changing to an innovation roadmap improve the ROI or effectiveness of the research work that's being done?
I have no clue, obviously, because I don't know this particular organization's case. But in general, a few questions to anyone who's wondering the same, or to the person who asked this question. First of all, great. So you have already targets on your technology development. How aware and how engaged is the rest of your organization? Are the business units and your marketing organization, etc., and whoever is relevant? How engaged are they with those targets? Do they know what those targets are? Do they agree with those targets? Do they subscribe to the market relevance of those targets? Right. We've made roadmaps, for example, for companies who were entering the EV space, and we've set targets on things like charging, right? Charging speeds, charging utilization, those kind of things. You have to know if your commercial organization actually agrees with those targets. They need to be aware of them, and they need to also agree that those targets are relevant. And you can take it one step further. You can even say, well, if we hit those targets, can we already get your commitment to future investments? So suppose we hit these targets, can we in principle count on you to fund the pilot, for example, or to fund the partnership that we need for further development? So getting that commitment early on is also important, because it ensures the continuous involvement of those parties.
Another question that comes from the chat box is about timing and for the entire process. So how often should you redo this roadmap or review it to prevent it from becoming static in a changing world, Dr. Hari?
Right. Now, the outcome of the roadmap are definitions of projects, are projects to be developed. So I'm not going to give you a specific time period here, because we have a very broad audience, and I think it depends a lot on what sector you're in. I would say general wisdom is updated every 2 or 4 years, give or take. But the real answer, the answer behind, is you need to allow those projects to come to fruition. Those projects will teach you something about your roadmap. So again, think back about that strategy cycle. Let me quickly see if I can go all the way back to this one. In order to give your roadmap a chance and to update your roadmap, you need to go through those other steps as well, which means that you should allow a good amount of the projects that you identified in the roadmap to at least get to halfway through the project. And preferably you should finish some of those projects before you think about updating the roadmap. Unless, of course, something drastic happens in your environment, right? So someone imposes trade barriers or tariffs suddenly, or then that change in the environment will trigger an update of your roadmap and of your entire strategy.
And there's one last question that we have time for in this webinar, Ari, is how does this road mapping process take open innovation into account? You see that more and more innovation is done in an open innovation environment rather than behind the closed doors of a research center. So how does that roadmap relate to how can you incorporate doing things in open innovation rather than everything yourself?
There are two opportunities to do that. So one, and I'm pulling up this picture with the various examples of roadmaps here. These three roadmaps, these three examples here, they are all open innovation roadmaps, meaning those roadmaps were developed not just with the relevant parties and stakeholders within your company, they were developed between companies. And the semiconductor roadmap is probably the biggest one, where the entire semicon industry basically is involved. But the others also were developed with a good number of stakeholders in the sector. So for the UK Net Zero Technology Centre, it's all of the stakeholders of the UK continental shelf. So everyone who's active offshore in the UK is involved there. So that's one. Roadmaps, I would always advise if you're just getting started with roadmaps to start small and start within your own organization, but you can develop roadmaps together with other companies. So then it becomes the definition of your joint open innovation agenda. That's one opportunity. There's another opportunity, because when you create the implementation plan, that's a definition of the project that you need to develop. One way to develop a project is to start an internal R&D project. And that's probably a pretty relatively easy way to develop a project. You get a proposal, you allocate funding, and you get started. But there are other ways to develop projects. And when I say project, I'm thinking of it in a very broad sense. So another way to develop a project is to invest in a startup. So corporate venturing is another way to create the same outcomes as you would have from a project. And of course, a way to do it is also to engage with an open innovation platform or with an open innovation cluster and start or create your own and start the project in open innovation. So two opportunities. One is the high road, create the roadmap together, create the roadmap for your open innovation initiative. And let's say the low road, but still very important and very relevant. Once you know what you want to do, seek out open innovation clusters that will help you do it.
Thank you very much, Ari. That concludes the webinar for today. The slides and recording of this webinar will be available to all attendees after today. After leaving the webinar, you will be prompted to complete a survey on today's presentation, and we would really appreciate your feedback to help and inform and improve future webinars. Also could recommend you to take a moment and check out our upcoming webinars. We do a lot of webinars that could be relevant for you, and we would be happy if you could join us. Thank you very much and enjoy the rest of your day.